Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I wish to make it absolutely crystal clear up front that I do support reform of early childhood education. I do support reforms that would genuinely make it more accessible, reforms that would genuinely make the payment arrangements more streamlined. I also want to make it abundantly clear, Deputy Speaker, that you will not find a stronger advocate for and supporter of the National Disability Insurance Scheme than me in this place. And it is absolutely vital that it remain true to its original intention of being a demand-driven program where anyone who genuinely needs support can go to the NDIS and get that support and not be capped by a budget or a shortage of money. So what I'm about to say over the next little while, Deputy Speaker, should in no way be taken as any absence or lesser support for early childhood education, and indeed early childhood educators, who do a wonderful job, and the NDIS. But this bill, the bill before the House at the moment, frankly, Deputy Speaker, is a shocker, an absolute shocker. And I won't support it, and I don't know how anyone in this place could bring themselves to support it. And look, I'm sorry, Deputy Speaker, I must have said this 100 times in this place, but it seems I've got to say it again. We are one of the luckiest, wealthiest, most fortunate countries in the world. A country with an annual federal budget of, it varies from year to year, but in the order of $400,000 million. Surely we are rich enough and lucky enough to look after properly the people that need to be looked after. Surely we're rich enough and lucky enough to be able to afford to support the most disadvantaged members of the community. But yet here we are, Deputy Speaker, here we are, and I share the, I associate myself with the comments we just heard. This is, we shouldn't be here debating this. We shouldn't have to come in here and debate whether or not to reduce the social security payment budget by $7,000 million a year. We can afford to pay that money. We can afford to not make these cutbacks to some of the most disadvantaged people in the country. Deputy Speaker, these are harsh cuts. These are very harsh cuts. And they're very harsh cuts directed squarely at the most disadvantaged members of our community. And I regret to remind members in this House that Australia's poverty rate to this day remains above the OECD average. I'll say that again. Australia's poverty rate remains above the OECD average, despite us being one of the richest and most fortunate countries in the world, despite us having a federal budget in the order of $400,000 million a year. In population terms, there are almost 3 million people living below the poverty line after taking account of housing costs in recent figures. The poverty rate for children in this country is in the order of 17.4%, or about 750,000 children. 750,000 children living below the poverty line in one of the richest countries in the world. That is a scandal, and that's a black mark on this place and what it has failed to achieve in recent years. By family type, lone parents experience the highest poverty rates at 33.2%. I'll say that again. It seems to be necessary to say these figures again. Something like a third of single parents are below the poverty line in one of the richest and most fortunate countries in the world, but we're in this place today talking about whether or not we should cut another $7,000 million from the welfare budget. I can't believe we're having this conversation. And it's not like we spend an outrageous amount of money and that we need to par it back. Because when I look at some very helpful figures provided by ACOS, and I'll read it here so I get the figures just right, expenditure on social security payments are lower than comparable countries. In fact, using recent figures, we spend about 8.6% of GDP on social security payments, compared with an OECD average of 12.4%. So, in other words, we're only spending about 2/3 of the OECD average on social security, but yet we're in here talking about cutting another $7,000 million from welfare payments. This is not defendable, and this bill is not supportable, Deputy Speaker. And it is not good enough for the government to come in here and say, well, look, it swings and roundabouts, so people ultimately will be better off. And again, I'll quote from ACOS. They've been very helpful here. They give an example. The increase to the Family Tax Benefit Part A for families with children will increase by $10 a week, but it does not make up for the cuts to the supplements. A sole parent with 2 children, aged 13 and 15, will still lose between $14 and $20 per week, or around $1,000 a year. So it is not the case that these people will ultimately somehow be better off. In this example, with the sole parent with 2 young children, they're going to be $1,000 a year worse off. And these aren't people on obscene incomes like we enjoy in this place. These are people who have no money left over already. Where will they get that $1,000? What will they cut back? What will they go without? I've already met people in my community who already, in the middle of winter in Hobart, are not turning the heating on because they can't afford the electricity. I've already met people in my electorate, in Hobart, in a capital city, in one of the richest countries in the world, who go without meals to pay for their medicines. I have met older Australians on the age pension who will even eat dog food in a capital city, in one of the richest countries in the world, with an annual budget, federal budget of close to $400 billion a year. But yet we come in here and we're talking about cutting another $7,000 million from the welfare budget. Now, Deputy Speaker, I'm the first to agree with the government that we need to re-engineer the budget. We do need to find savings. We do need to find other sources of revenue. We do need to get the budget back into balance over the economic cycle. The government's own figures. By fiscal 18-19, our total debt, government debt, federal government debt, will be in the order of $356 billion. $356 billion, $250 billion. We do have to fix that. But why on earth, Deputy Speaker, are we going after some of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable people in the country? Is it because they're not the people putting big donations into the political parties, the people that are currying favour? Why don't we come in here and collegiately talk about big reform? Because I tell you what, Deputy Speaker, we won't repair the budget, even if we go ahead with measures like are contained in this omnibus bill. $7 billion. That's an enormous amount of money to take away from disadvantaged people, but it's a drop in the ocean when it comes to repairing the budget. What the budget needs is deep structural reform. What the country needs are big, inspiring political leaders telling us what needs to be done and guiding us through it. In my experience, the Australian community will support big, bold governments when the need for reform is explained to them and the package of reforms is sold effectively. But we're not seeing that at the moment. In fact, in this country, Deputy Speaker, we have such a shortage of big, inspiring leaders, people you'd follow to war. I tell you what, as I look around this place, there are precious few people that I'd follow to war. I see a generation of professional politicians who are tinkering around the edges and thinking that the solution is taking $7 billion from Australia's most disadvantaged and vulnerable people. Well, I tell you what the sort of things we should be talking about. What about a genuine clampdown on multinational tax avoidance? That would be a strong start. Now, I do note that the government in recent times has taken some small steps that, if they are successful, might— well, no, I'll say to the member for Dawson, I've said good on the government for taking some steps. However, by your own figures, those steps might only bring in about $1 billion a year. But that still leaves, by some estimates, $4 to $5 billion of tax avoidance going on, even after those measures are implemented and if they're implemented effectively. So there's $4 to $5 billion to be had out there from multinationals who, through all sorts of devious means, are avoiding their reasonable tax obligations. $4 or $5 million. That's $16 to $20 billion over the budget and forward estimates. 3 times the amount of money that's going to be saved in this bill, just by making the big, rich multinationals pay their fair share. And, Deputy Speaker, what about domestic firms? Now, I've been unable, I don't think anyone knows, to come up with an exact figure or even a rough figure of the scope of tax avoidance by domestic companies. But I can find this figure, that the difference between what corporations pay in tax in Australia currently, the difference between that figure, what they actually pay, and what would be paid if they all paid their 30%, that shortfall is $8 billion a year. Now, of course, we can't hope to recoup all of that because businesses have all sorts of reasonable deductions. But I tell you what, we could recoup some of that. Let's say we recouped a quarter of that, $2 billion a year, $8 billion over the budget and forward estimates, would more than pay for this ruthless cut to welfare for some of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable people in the country. And what about a proper super profits tax? The banks last year made $30,000 million, and not just in gross terms, but also a significant profit as measured as a return on their investment. The banks, $30,000 million. Well, how about they pay a bit more tax? And how about any company in this country that gets a super return on their investment, no matter how big or small, how about they pay a bit more tax? They can afford to pay a bit more tax. They can afford to pay a bit more tax, a darn sight better than the most disadvantaged and vulnerable people in this country. You know, a single mum with 2 young kids can afford to go without $1,000. And we'll go without meals, we'll go without medicines, we'll go without electricity, while the banks get off scot-free. BHP in the last 6 months, made $8,000 million profit. $8,000 million profit in 6 months. Well, good on them, but better off them if they paid a bit more tax and helped out the community that has supported them over many, many years. What about capital gains discounts? We talk a lot about negative gearing, and that's fine. Let's talk about capital gains discounts, which most experts would agree is skewing the housing market. Let's get rid of those discounts. That'll save us $1 billion a year, $4 billion over the budget and forward estimates, and more than half the amount of money we're trying to save today. Why don't we get rid of the $50 billion in tax cuts for big business? These are the sorts of measures we need, but they will only happen when we have politicians who are visionary and strong and prepared to make the big decision. And I tell you what, Deputy Speaker, the public will accept big, bold decisions when they're necessary, when they're explained, when they're sold by inspiring leaders. And to help sell it, why don't we all take a 25% pay cut? I tell you what, that would make some of the tough decisions in the broader community more palatable. I know, I looked around there, everyone's staring at me as though I've grown, I won't say 2 heads. But seriously, please, colleagues and Deputy Speaker, the community will accept big, bold reform when it comes from big, bold, inspiring leaders and when it's sold well and when all of us, including ourselves, or share in the cutbacks. But at the moment, we've got a government trying to take $7,000 million from the most disadvantaged and vulnerable people in the community, while at the same time wanting to give a big tax cut to big business, while taking no action against the banks while they pull in $30,000 million profit, no action against companies like BHP who make $8,000 million profit in 6 months. Deputy Speaker, this is a shocker of a bill. I won't support it. I'm pleased that the opposition won't support it. I hope my colleagues here won't support it. And I tell you what, if some of the members of the government had any guts, they'd cross the floor and they wouldn't support it.
I thank the member.